Kant and Transcendental Aesthetic. Before we begin, our starting point for understanding how the mind works in Kant's philosophy will be transcendental aesthetic. The concept of aesthetics here does not refer to beauty as we use it in our daily lives. Rather, it explains how the perception-based information process works. We will go into the details of this as the video continues. The concepts of time and space are also important here, because we need to understand transcendental aesthetics within the framework of these concepts. Transcendental philosophy. We briefly touched upon Kant's concept of transcendental. According to Kant, this concept refers to the a priori forms of knowledge. Of course, it is necessary to explain what a priori means. To understand this concept, we also need to know the concept of a posteriori. A posteriori means experimental. We will go into more detail later, but what is experimental is usually related to data we obtain through our senses. Kant does not think of the relationship between the experimental and the senses in the same way that empiricists do. According to him, experience makes a kind of presentation to us. This presentation leads to the perception of the objects we experience as images. Unlike empiricists, Kant says that this image is a formality belonging to our mind. The formality here is pure, as is a priori. In Kant's philosophy, this purity means universality and necessity. If we consider Kant's definition, the concept of transcendental tries to explain the necessity of knowledge, so the formality in our experiences, according to Kant, means understanding the transcendental structure. The translation of the concept of transcendental as transcendent is also a point to be noted. If it is translated as the affirmation of the transcendent, it can lead to a misunderstanding. Although the translation of transcendent is not very problematic, for Kant, transcendental is not used in the sense of transcendent. In fact, these two concepts are presented as opposite to each other by Kant. As we mentioned before, transcendental knowledge refers to the formality that forms the basis of experience. However, the concept of transcendent cannot be related to the formality of knowledge because it goes beyond the limits of experience. Therefore, while transcendental has a positive meaning, transcendent has a negative meaning. According to Kant, our experiences do not give us necessity. Therefore, what is necessary must be something different from experience. Furthermore, we should not think of the concept of transcendental only within the framework of certain concepts. As we said before, whenever we encounter any a priori concept of knowledge, we must also take into account the concept of transcendental. Therefore, the categories that we will examine later will also be discussed under this concept. Elements of time and space. The first part of transcendental doctrine begins with transcendental aesthetics. Kant begins here by defining sensitivity and intuition. Intuition is the foundation of knowledge and thought. Kant says that intuition only emerges when we encounter an object. To be affected by an object is to be affected by it in a certain way, and Kant calls this receptivity. Sensitivity is affected by the object in a certain way. This form is called intuition, and intuition is a part of sensitivity. Objects are thought of by our minds, and thus concepts are formed. Concepts are somehow connected to intuition and therefore to sensitivity. The effect of the object on our imagination is not related to sensation. The effect of intuition on our sensation is experimental. The undetermined object on experimental intuition is appearance. Time and space are the pure concepts that form the basis of transcendental aesthetics. The word aesthetics is of Greek origin and is related to sensation. However, historically, this concept has been associated with the sense of beauty. Kant's concept of aesthetics is closer to its first use, so we need to understand a situation related to sensation from the concept of aesthetics used by Kant. When we add the concept of transcendental, we come across a concept like a formal sensation. In fact, what Kant is trying to explain is what the formal elements of sensation are. Time and space are defined as the forms of the mind found in sensation. We need to understand these structures before we can acquire any knowledge about an object. So even if we ignore all the properties of an object, the property of that object, not itself, but its existence and thinkability, depends on these concepts. Kant says that these concepts are pure, a priori concepts that come from our minds, not from objects. Kant attaches so much importance to these concepts that he calls the formalization of our senses by them sensitivity. We need to place sensitivity at the foundation of sensation, which is the source of our senses. So, for anything to be sensed in time and space, it must first exist within the framework of form given by sensitivity. For example, for the apple in my hand to affect me as sensory data, it must be in my hand, that is, in a space. Let me give another example. For us to perceive a table, it must be in a room or in a classroom, that is, in a place. Kant believes that any object must be in a place called space in order to exist and therefore be sensed. Furthermore, space has its own unique formality. Objects in space appear to us side by side. This formality does not belong to the object, but to our way of sensing it, which is our sensitivity. The important point here is whether space is something that can be perceived or a condition of perception. Although we can perceive things in space, we cannot generally perceive space itself. What we think of as space is actually the parts of space. For example, the palm of our hand, the room, the classroom are all parts of space. Therefore, space as a pure form is a possibility of magnitude. That is, our hand has a magnitude, and the room has a magnitude. These are the parts of space that are formal and include properties such as magnitude. Space is a form that allows us to perceive objects in the external world. Kant calls this external sense. In contrast, Kant proposes another form or pure aesthetic concept that he calls internal sense, and that is more fundamental than space, time. The formality that time adds to everything we perceive is in the form of events happening in succession or simultaneously. In addition to an object being outside, that is, in a part of space, it must also be perceived at that moment. This now actually refers to the units of time called moments. Time can be defined as the sum of moments. However, defining moments as the smallest unit of time can be confusing. For example, when we try to understand what a moment is, we actually move into that moment. When we think carefully, we realize that there is another moment within a moment, and that this continues indefinitely. Therefore, we can say that in addition to the existence of a moment, how that moment exists is also important. This succession that we are talking about is very important. Moments come one after another to form time and give us basic concepts such as number and mathematics. For example, let's think of a moment as a unit. When we represent this unit with the number 1, according to the principle of succession, 2 comes after 1, and so on. Therefore, time is more fundamental than space for two reasons. First, in order for me to be here, I must first exist temporally, which allows me to exist spatially. Second, time must exist for a fundamental science like mathematics to exist. We have touched upon the concept of experience many times. It is important to understand it well, as we will come across it later as well. According to Kant, experience is an area that both shapes and is shaped by our knowledge structure. Actually, if you look at a famous quote by Kant, this statement is not entirely accurate. Although Kant says that all our knowledge begins with experience, he also states that not all knowledge comes from experience. So experience does not include what is a priori. However, according to Kant, a structure formed only by thought, that is, a concept, would be empty. In this case, experience is an area where both the mental and the experimental come together. We need to clearly understand here that experience represents knowledge. So neither categories nor time and space alone can create experience. For experience to represent knowledge, these two must come together. Kant's concept of experience can be thought of as a concept of existence in a way. It should be thought of as a general concept that encompasses different realms, not a specific area. Therefore, we can think of nature as a realm of experience, and we can think of the world as a realm of experience. Structurally, Any realm in which time and space and categories operate represents experience for us. According to Kant's philosophy, it is through this experience that we can acquire knowledge. So experience means that a structure belonging to our mind provides information about the external world. Therefore, we should approach experience from the perspective of knowledge, not reality. We can say that Kant puts philosophy in a difficult position. The concept he calls Ding and Sich, which translates as thing in itself, states that we cannot know how objects really are. Because time, space and categories belong to our minds, we perceive objects with our own way of thinking. This means that we perceive objects as images, not as they are. Kant says that knowledge belongs not to real objects, but to appearances, that is, to the phenomenal realm. This shows that the realm of experience has been a realm of reality from the beginning. In short, according to Kant, time and space are the subjective conditions of sensitivity. Time is the condition of internal things, and space is the condition of external things. Therefore, time is internal sense, and space is external sense. Kant approaches the fact that objects are side by side outside from two perspectives. First, these have an experiential reality as the outward appearances of objects. However, when we look at objects from their own perspective, this reality actually contains a transcendental ideal. In this video, we discussed the concept of transcendental, which has an important place in Kant's philosophy. Then we touched upon the concepts of time and space, which we encounter in connection with this concept. We examined that these form the basis of experience, and how experience corresponds to an understanding of reality. The point we want to emphasize in particular is that reality is dependent on human subjectivity. However, subjectivity should not be confused with arbitrariness here.